So how do we change this? This is normal. So Anna and I will be talking about 5 years of climate change and vegetation change and human history in the Amboseli region. And this is part of a larger ongoing project that's taking part in East Africa. So we are PhD students in that, and that's one of our study areas. So for the first bit of the presentation, I'll introduce the study area, the research, my main research aim and the methods that I used, a small bit of my results and the challenges that I've experienced, which will then introduce Anna's bit of the work. So why Amboseli? The Amboseli ecosystem is a bushed grassland savanna. And as we've had, the East African savannas support almost a population of 30 million people. And it's important to understand how they've evolved over time to the current ecosystem and how that affects land use and land change. So this whole area is about 300 kilometers squared, and the labels that we've put on are some of the wetlands. All the water in the Amboseli ecosystem is groundwater wetlands because there's the main water comes from Mount Kilimanjaro and some from the Chulu Hills. So the whole area is supported by groundwater wetlands, and there are just a few of them, mainly concentrated around this region. This bit is when we first started the research project. We wanted to find out what wetlands were there at the beginning of the aerial mapping of the area. What could we find? And so these are aerial photos taken from the 1910, 1920, and these are some of the wetlands we were able to identify on the photos. And unfortunately, some of them have dried up, but I've been lucky enough to work in 2 or 3 of them. So the first one is the Kimana Sanctuary and the Omakau Swamp. And these 2 photos show we've been taking aerial photographs of the swamps to try and look at what the current ecology looks like. And they're really beautiful wetlands, as you can see. So my overall research aim for this area is what has been the vegetation change over time and the climate change over time, and how have these two been interacting. And the methods that I've used to do this, I've taken quite a few approaches because it's quite a difficult question to try and answer. And my main focus is the paleoecological bit. So by using pollen analysis, we've carried out, we went to the field in 2014 and 2015, carried out some coring and also for modern pollen sampling. And the point of looking at the pollen is to look at the vegetation. We've also taken, from the same sediment cores, we've also looked at the charcoal to try and come up with the fire history of the region. And both of this we've tried to do at a very high resolution. So for the charcoal, we've done it at every centimeter, and for the pollen has been at every 10 centimeters. But we also have modern pollen samples which are still being analyzed. At the same time, I also got the chance to do the XRF iTrack scanning to get some elemental profiles from the records, and of course the dating of the sediment records so that we can see how far back they go. So this is an example from one of my sites. This is called Esambu Swamp. And this record goes back 5,000 years. And the reason I've chosen this diagram is it's sort of a summary diagram that just shows you what the main pollen types in this area are. And as you can see, it's mainly the kind of vegetation that you would expect to find in a grassland savanna. So we have acacia, we have acalypha, we have balanitis and commiphora. And that is what has been fluctuating over time. We also have Sporomiella. Sporomiella is fungal spores. Fungal spore counting is done to try and provide a signal for human impact of interaction of humans with the environment by looking at the spores that's in the dung of the herbivores. But sometimes the signal can be confused with wild herbivore density data, because in the wetlands, everything is coming to water at the swamps. It's not just the goats and the sheep and the cows. So over the last 5,000 years, Amboseli has just been a bush grassland savanna. Sometimes there's a little bit more rainfall than others, and then when that happens, the charcoal increases, because then there's more fuel for the fire. And when the rainfall is low, there's less fuel, so there's less fires. This Rob already showed us this diagram before, so I won't go into the details, but the point of trying to come up with this kind of representation is to try and make paleoecological data accessible to a wider group of people, because instead of looking at the previous diagram where it's just wiggly lines and we're not exactly sure what's happening, here we're trying to show what the landscape looks at each time slice, and the time slices are actually statistically defined, and this makes it easier to share the information with other people, because they can see what is happening at each point. So the notes on that bit is just how. So for example, between 5,000 to 2,000 years ago, it was quite dry. There was a lot of acacia, there was a lot of Caparis and Acanthesi, and then at 2,000 years, it became a wet period. However, across the Amboseli landscape, and that is why I'm also looking at a few wetlands and not just one, we've seen that the signal is localized. So sometimes these wet periods are not synchronized across the landscape, and that is one of the things that I'm still in the process of trying to understand why that's happening. So in both the two diagrams, we can see how the vegetation has changed over time. We can somehow relate that to climate change, but how do we relate that to, how do we show the human history? How do we know what impact? How do we know there's no signal, we can't see the signal of human impact on the environment? And that is the work that Anna is doing, and she'll explain to us how she's been able to look at some of these things.
Thanks, Esther. Okay, tag. Right now. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'm Anna. I don't actually go here. I'm just visiting from Uppsala, and I've jumped on this opportunity to speak today, as there are other members of the REAL project here. So as Esther mentioned, my thesis is coming from this archaeological perspective, using the research framework of historical ecology to think about the human history of Amboseli. So I'm going to talk about how I'm engaging with this topic of people and plants, and I'm going to share a bit about preliminary results from archaeobotanical analysis and how I've been learning from ethnobotanical pursuits. So just a bit of background, my PhD is, I spent a good chunk of last year doing surveys and excavations in this area here, and did some small scale excavations at these locations, which I think are pastoral settlements ranging in age from about 1750 to 1950. Oh no, I think, so we combined our slides, so some of my headers are missing there, apologies. Anyway, so I have about 184 samples of archaeobotanical samples from 7 of the sites that we excavated at now. And so the idea with taking these sediment samples is to try and find and identify burnt bits of plants. And after you've gone through this sort of laborious process, you can try and interpret this information to know more about what kinds of plants had uses and values and were living and growing and being traded and transported across the landscapes that people were living in. And it's also useful for learning a bit about the layout of sites. For instance, is this spot, we dug up, is this potentially a cooking fire or a garbage heap or something else entirely? So the method for extracting these nice bits of charred material from archaeological sediments is called flotation. So you take your sediments and you add some water, scoop off the stuff that floats, and then you let that dry and head off to the lab. And if you're fortunate, you have a lot of identifying materials that you can find under the microscope. And this is actually, so what I'm doing here in New York at the moment, in the environment department, is looking through these light fractions. However, it's been noted that my predecessors, that pastoral sites in East Africa tend to have very little in the way of domesticated plant species, and archaeobotanical analysis has been a bit sidelined in pastoral sites. And I suspect this has something to do with the fact that people have low expectations for the recovery of these sort of major domesticated cereal crops. And this trend appears to be holding true so far for my samples from Amboseli. And I have reason to believe that people who inhabited the sites excavated, they would have been participating in trade networks that would have given them access to crops like maize and sorghum and beans and plantains in particular would have been a really commonly enjoyed food. And so these domesticated plant foods would not have been produced in Amboseli, but instead on the fertile slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, which is just south of my study area. But I'm not finding any or much of this stuff in the samples I've looked at. I didn't expect, obviously, to find banana seeds. But as for legumes and cereals, this may be because people were not eating these foods or only consuming them in small quantities. Maybe because these foods were prepared in such a way so that they would be unlikely to be recovered and identified archaeobotanically. So for instance, it's a common practice today in Amboseli to grind cereal grains into flour outside in the fresh air and away from the cooking area. This kind of limits the opportunities for whole grains to encounter fires and become nicely burnt, recoverable materials. But I'm not finished looking through my samples. We're about halfway, so we'll see. However, cultivated crops are not the only plant species that can tell an interesting story here. So during fieldwork last year, I spent some time engaging with local people to learn a bit about what it means to be a pastoralist in Amboseli. And some of our discussions focused on looking at non-cultivated edible plant foods that occur here. And I was really interested to hear about what kinds of plants people were eating, how they're preparing these foods, at what time of year would these foods be available, and where they're located in the landscape. So, you know, we did some semi-structured interviews and some participatory mapping exercises. Mostly it was just kind of walking around to places and then, you know, pointing out plants and okay, thanks. And mapping things, you know, with my GPS, taking photos and learning these local taxonomies. So here are some pictures of sort of an afternoon of map drawing. So I asked these guys to show me where in the study area would you be likely to encounter sort of various resources, including plant foods. So here are some kind of boring lists of species that I did manage to identify that people had said they were consumed. So some of these foods are things like edible tubers. Some can be eaten and roasted, like nkale. Some like ngoskos, people mention they really love to find when they're out on a really hot day and they're herding animals, because these tubers are full of a nice sweet liquid and they're pleasant to chew on. There are lots of edible fruits growing here as well, such like homuncula and ori and el masigio are known to be sort of food for children. It's because when kids are out sort of herding animals, they're kind of picking these little berries, and I think it kind of illustrates how many of these foods are not, as one might think, sort of foods of last resort, only turned to during times of famine. And the vast majority would not have been even available during droughts. Actually, they're mostly in season after the rains. So they're, in addition, things like legumes like sagalam from the acacia tree, which is eaten by people and it's also important for goats, and roots, which are boiled and used to make teas and soups. Also edible leafy greens, prepared like sakuma wiki. Okay, so also thinking about the places in the landscapes where these foods would be available is interesting. So I've been working on creating a map of a sort of biogeoclimatic zones of Amboseli, compiling this from various sources. And then using this and also the maps created by local people to kind of visually illustrate the non-cultivated plant food resource hotspots, if you will, in this area. And I'm trying to kind of improve the resolution of this map by bringing in data on location of riverbeds and density of settlements. As some plant species, sort of prefer alluvial zones, and others like to colonize abandoned pastoral settlements. And of course, adding in the variable of seasonal availability, so I can kind of create a temporal and spatial distributions of wild plant foods in Amboseli. And I'm trying to bring these sort of biogeoclimatic perspectives of this landscape into dialogue with local perspectives of plants in Amboseli to present an alternative understanding of vegetation in this place. So still in the process of sorting and working through identifications of plant remains from archaeobotanical samples, and I've certainly found it very enlightening to reflect on the limitations of macrobotanical analysis. It's really kind of a blunt tool for understanding how people engage with plants. And many plants and plant parts that are valued by people in Amboseli are not recoverable in the archaeological record. Many are not consumed in domestic context or on site. Many are not exposed to charring and would be difficult to preserve. And I certainly don't presume to have a complete understanding of the value of every plant species in Amboseli from a local perspective. The medicinal applications of plants in Amboseli alone are incredibly vast and were not really focused on during my fieldwork. And of course, traditions of plant use, while to some degree are likely intergenerational and place-based, they are not timeless and static. So what a pastoralist in Amboseli today thinks of as food may not have been what a pastoralist in Amboseli 200 years ago would have been interested in eating. So this knowledge production process is always partial and dictated by specific people and events and timings. However, through engaging with local people in Amboseli and learning about their histories of trade relations with farmers beyond the basin, also of course about wild plant foods that are distributed in the landscape, the interpretations of plant remains found in archaeological context sort of takes on a new focus. For instance, a charred amaranthus seed, which is the kind of thing that's kind of frequently labeled as just sort of like weedy, intrusive material, it could potentially be interpreted as the remains of a meal of nagumwe greens. So this research is kind of dedicated to dialoguing multiple perspectives, and that of course also includes paleo-environmental. So on remains of the past and doing this process, fully aware that I'm doing this in the present, and trying to diversify and sort of complicate and reveal new histories of human-plant relationships in the basin. So, the end. Sorry about the slide title.
The question's obviously for Esther or Anna, or both. Go on.